What's going on, guys? This is Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. And your guys are probably wondering, why did I put Desmond Llewelyn on the previous stream when I was covering Goldeneye and Tomorrow Never Dies? Well, it's because with this one, The World Is Not Enough, this was the last time we get to see Desmond Llewelyn play Q. And of course, John Cleese, he's in this film as the assistant, and eventually he is the successor to playing the character of Q when we go into Die Another Day. Now, I will admit that I recently rewatched both The World Is Not Enough, and just to be clear, I have the special edition on DVD, and then the same case with this Die Another Day. And for the record here, I want to be clear. This is just my preference / opinion here. Out of the four, from my personal experience, I would say that Die Another Day is, in my honest opinion, the weakest entry in the Brosnan era compared to the previous three. And I know I'm not the only one here that actually is going with this. But anyway, before I forget, I should have mentioned this earlier. That's my fault. But for those of you who have your favorites in terms of Bond and all of that, I want to give a quick shout out to the Phoenix Press. I should have done this on the previous stream. That's my fault. Apologies there, Phoenix. But anyway, if you guys want to hear some opinions with regards to their favorite Bonds and all of that, like which one is your favorite, again, go ahead and check it out. And I put it in the link in the description below for those of you who want to check it out. But anyway, let us begin here with the third film, The World Is Not Enough. And I am going to be kind of going over at least, who was in it, because of this little booklet here. Obviously, we have Brosnan playing 007 again. We also have Sophie Marceau, who plays Electra King, the daughter of the late Sir Robert King, who was a former friend of M. I'm just trying to read through my notes here real quick. We also have the very beautiful, and I have to admit, really hot, Denise Richards, who plays Christmas Jones. Obviously, we also have Judi Dench, who plays M. And again, I already mentioned about Desmond Llewelyn, who plays Q for the final time, and John Cleese, who plays R in this case. And the only reason why it's mentioned as why he's called R, it's because of 007, and I'll get to that point later. But we start off with Bond going to picking up some ransom money over in Spain, and he's basically trying to get some information from a Swiss banker, and basically the information that Bond said he was trying to obtain was from someone else, and he needs the name of the person who killed this informant. Unfortunately, before the Swiss banker is able to speak any further, he gets assassinated, and then Bond has to then escape with getting the money. And by the time he does return back, he then gets to meet face to face and a good old friend of M, Sir Robert King, with regards to when he returns the money. However, as Bond is being given the lowdown in terms of what's going on with regards to the oil tycoon and all of that, he finds out that um, something is amiss, and then that Sir Robert King was the target of an assassination, and whoever wanted him dead basically um, used the money as bait. So eventually, we get this really cool boat chase, and I'm going to be kind of reading through from this little booklet here. Um, it mentions that um, Bond is piloting a Benz jet propelled boat that was borrowed from Q Branch, and obviously Q is pointing out to the 007 it hasn't been finished yet. And according to the booklet, it mentions that they used, CGI for this. There was a virtual armada of 35 boats that was used to create this sequence that was filmed on the Thames over a 7-day period. Even though stunt performers were used for some of the most dangerous shots, Brosnan remained in the cockpit for most of the scenes. And he was cruising up to speeds up to 80 miles per hour. Now, if you're trying to put that in perspective in terms of how fast a boat's going, I would definitely recommend taking a look at. I'm going to kind of deviate a little bit here. I would recommend taking a look at a video from Top Gear, and it has to do with some fun competition comparisons between Hammond and Clarkson. So Clarkson is using a boat, and Hammond is using a really fancy automobile. I forgot which episode it was, but they're both trying to prove something. And usually with boats, when they're measuring speed, they're going at a certain number of knots. So for those of you guys who are familiar with, being on boats and all of that, you likely know this more than I do, but 80 miles an hour, you're likely going at a certain speed, if you will. But anyway, Bond eventually manages to catch up to a point with the assassin, and it gets to them being on a hot air balloon, and he's trying to convince the assassin, I just need a name. Who is, starting all this? And he's trying to tell the assassin, I can help you. Don't do this. But the female assassin is saying, you can't protect me. Not from him. Before she commits suicide, destroying the gas tank, exploding it, and Bond obviously suffers from a fractured shoulder as a result of this. And we learn later on that Bond was over at the funeral, and he sees the former daughter, Electra King, and she somehow recognizes him when he was there. But Bond is unfortunately temporarily grounded, but he kind of manages to seduce the doctor into giving him a so-called clean bill of health. And it is at this point where we get the introduction or explanation of the KGB terrorist known as Renard. And M mentions that she had sent 009. We don't know who 009 is to kill Renard. And despite, you know, 009's attempts to kill Renard, when it came to paying the ransom for Elektra, Bond actually does a little digging on his end. And he finds out that the amount in British pounds, roughly 3 million, and I think the number was like 3,003 pounds with some change left over. When you converted it into American dollars, it becomes the ransom money in 5 million. And when Bond is pressing M to, answer some questions about Electra King and what the heck is going on, M pretty much is berating Bond, stating that I will not tolerate, disorder and disobedience. And she's telling him, though, don't make this personal. But unfortunately, I don't think it is actually Bond's fault in trying to make it personal. Yes, M is trying to keep Bond in line, but he knows that something is amiss. And despite, what happened with Sir Robert King, M is basically telling Bond to not let Elektra know. He needs to keep certain things close to the vest. And basically, when it comes to it, Bond does manage to meet up with Elektra when he's actually going to inspect the pipeline. And he does try to keep his reasons for being around, as subtle as he can. So eventually, both of them do go skiing a little bit, but they're being tracked by, some supposed assassins. And eventually, one of the former henchmen who was tasked with keeping an eye on Elektra goes to meet with Renard himself. And we basically find out over time that the scientist who loaned Renard those snowmobiles, if you will, to try and kill Bond and Elektra, they were just prototypes. And as a result, Renard is like, with regards to loyalty and all that, he shoots the scientist that loaned him those snowmobiles. And eventually, Bond is forced to play the role of a scientist. So eventually, the former henchman that was tasked with keeping an eye on Elektra, he eventually gets rid of him, if you will. So when Bond actually leaves Elektra after sleeping with her, he does kind of ask, how the heck did she escape? And she gives a brief explanation of, she used her body to seduce the guards and then eventually shot the rest and somehow managed to escape. But anyway, he manages to head over to where he needs to be, which is where he reaches a nuclear silo, and it is from there that he meets the nuclear physicist, Dr. Christmas Jones. And as a result, when Bond goes in, he finds Renard, and Renard obviously recognizes Bond. And despite Bond's attempts at trying to prevent the nuke from leaving, Renard removes the locator card and the plutonium that was inside. As a result, he and Christmas are trapped inside, but Bond eventually manages to escape with her and manages to steal not just the locator card, but also both manage to figure out that, okay, we're supposed to be on the same team here, and since this guy is actually, nuts, we'll have to try to figure out what's going on. So when Bond goes to Azerbaijan over in the Middle East, roughly, he tells M that Electra King is likely not who she appears, and she may have succumbed to Stockholm Syndrome when she was captured by Renard. And he pretty much points out to Electra that he knows that she's not who she appears, that the whole thing was likely staged, and despite her initial disgust at the accusation, Bond is eventually proven right. So when he and Dr. Christmas go to try to defuse the bomb that's inside the pipeline, Electra eventually betrays M, and so as a result, when Bond and Christmas are trying to defuse the bomb, he finds out that the only reason why he lets it go off is that Electra is trying to stage the whole thing as terrorists trying to sabotage her father's legacy. And Jones, Dr. Christmas Jones, eventually finds out that with one half missing, that they're planning on using it for something. So the explosion is used as a good cover for both Bond and Dr. Jones, because one, the enemy can assume that one, they're dead as a result, and two, they can use that cover as a means of trying to figure out where Electra is and why, she's doing what she's doing. But prior to that, I'm going to jump back a little bit here. There's a moment where Bond finds out that there's a card game that Electra plays with Zukovsky over at a casino to get some information regarding who was attacking Electra originally. But when the amount of $1 million, you know, catches Bond's attention, he knows that something is off. Yes, she loses the money, but when Bond goes to confront Zukovsky, he knows that the whole thing was hush money. And they eventually find out that Zukovsky was paid to keep his mouth shut. And obviously, one of Zukovsky's men is actually a traitor. So when M is captured, there's an interesting little exchange between her and Renard. And she's basically telling Renard, after she was caught, "I hope you're proud with what you've done to her." And Renard fires back, saying, "You actually deserve some of that credit, considering, what you did to betray her." And the irony with the whole thing is that a while ago I did say that Bond was correct in his assessment of Elektra and how she was psychologically manipulated by Renard. And, she obviously fell in love with her captor, which is essentially what happened when M gets captured and betrayed. So when Bond eventually confronts Zukovsky at his caviar factory, they both find out, Bond and Dr. Jones, that Renard is trying to use the stolen plutonium to cause a nuclear meltdown in a submarine, and that's over in Istanbul. So, in summary, by using the stolen plutonium, Renard is going to cause the meltdown in the sub within the area of Istanbul to destroy the pipelines that are over in Russia, which would leave King's pipeline the only one usable. So essentially, by the time Bond and Dr. Jones does get captured, Elektra does try to convince Bond to join her side. And eventually, Zukovsky comes in and manages to take out most of, Elektra's henchmen before coming in and trying to confront Elektra. But unfortunately, Zukovsky actually had a brother, and he was in the Russian military. Unfortunately for him, the brother gets killed, as well as the crew. So when he tries to get his revenge, Elektra manages to get the jump on him for a few brief seconds. And Zukovsky has a few rounds in his cane. So when Elektra sees him pointing his cane gun at Bond, she's thinking, "Oh, he's actually going to kill him." But instead, he actually shoots one of the cuffs that got Bond bound before he dies. And eventually, Bond himself manages to get Bond manages to free himself, and Elektra is essentially taunting Bond at this point because, she was manipulating him. And he is simply telling Elektra, you can stop this by, trying to have Renard, to stand down. But instead, she sticks with Renard and tells him to dive. And at this point, Bond is like, I gave you your chance. You wasted it. And just kills her out straight. But that's after he manages to free M. So both Dr. Christmas and Bond manages to get inside the Russian sub. And eventually, when it comes to trying to stop him, unfortunately, the controls do get obliterated, and instead of going up, they're actually going down. And Renard manages to extract the nuclear substance from the plutonium and put it into a rod. So by the time Bond does try to stop Renard, eventually what he does to stop him is he finds one of the coolant pipes. Well, not exactly a pipe, but it's a tube that connects to the reactor, a coolant tube. I don't know why I keep saying tube. Anyway, he manages to reconnect the cooling mechanism to the reactor, which then in turn causes the grid to light up. And despite the nuclear rod being put in all the way, Bond knows there's only one way to stop him. And by the time he connects the coolant back in, he's looking at Renard stating, after he killed her and all that, she's waiting for you. The thing is that when Bond breaks the news to Renard that, she's dead, he practically loses it and attempts to try to trap him. But of course, when the coolant does get disconnected and Bond reattaches the coolant, he pushes the very middle of the reactor, which of course ejects the rod, essentially impaling Renard and finally killing him at that point. I'm going to have to backtrack just a little bit. Well, not a little bit, but more like a lot. Earlier, when Bond is given, not just the new car to use, Q eventually introduces his replacement, and there's a really amusing moment where Bond is jokingly stating, if you're Q, does that make him R? And the way how Bond actually addresses Q when he's asking him, you're not really going into retirement, are you? And Q is basically telling Bond, there have always been two things I tried to teach you. One, Never let them see you bleed. And Bond asks him, what's the second? Always come up with an escape plan. And with that, we see that's the last time we see that's the last time we see Q, as well as the actor Desmond Llewelyn when he went to retire from acting. Anyway, getting back into the film here, when Bond eventually manages to take a break from the whole thing, he is obviously with Dr. Christmas over in Turkey, and um, R, who is now Q, um, when as they're waiting for him to return, they're trying to figure out the whereabouts of 007, and they eventually find out where he is through some thermal vision technology, and eventually they both find. The rest of MI6 find, Bond is sleeping with, Dr. Jones at that point, and M is like verbally like shocked and berating him, thinking it's like, how could you be so like naughty in a sense? And then John Cleese's character is like, oh, it must be a bug variant of some type. And with that, I was just giving like a rough summary of what's going on with this film. But overall, I will say that this one, before we get into Die Another Day, I would say that the writing is, in my opinion, well, before I go on subjectively, objectively, I would say that this is actually pretty good, if not like at least better than what we get in Die Another Day. But if I had to like give it a score plot wise, I would say maybe a 7 out of 10. But but subjectively, I would give this at least an 8, since this film, as well as Goldeneye, if you notice a slight parallel here, it does deal with post Cold War ramifications, if you will. Again, with Goldeneye, we had a former rogue agent, take revenge on the British government because his family was killed by, the Soviets. So he eventually defected, and he's accusing the British government of doing nothing. With this one, you have a former KGB agent who becomes a terrorist, and obviously with Americans and their obsession with Russians, as a common villain, we see here that, the British government having to deal with the fallout of their actions, although it's not very clear. But a oil tycoon who actually has an agenda against the Brits, or at least the daughter does, being psychologically manipulated by a communist nonetheless. Basically, I would say that the story is somewhat okay, but not exactly as fulfilling. The action in this one, I would say, is pretty decent. The villain in Renard, I would say, while supposedly formidable, is not as threatening compared to, say, the former rogue agent 006 or um, the media mogul Elliot Carver. In terms of, I guess I could say, psychological warfare, with Carver, I would say, and his use of the media to manipulate people, I think that one's more plausible compared to what Renard is trying to do, which is cause a global meltdown and then cause it, which would cause an increase in, oil prices. Trying to collapse, the American economy that way doesn't seem as plausible compared to the other one, in my observation. Character wise, if I had to compare Electra and then what was her name? Oh yeah, Onatop. There we go. If I had to compare Onatop and Electra in terms of the femme fatale, arguably, from my observation, I would say that Onatop may be more on the physical end, whereas with Electra, she tries to be more on the mental, um, in terms of like emotional manipulation and all of that, while also using her feminine wiles to manipulate men. However, if I had to say which one actually does it better, I'd say, in my opinion, it's a tie. Now, in terms of like um, favorite Bond girl, if I'm looking at it from the Brosnan era, if I really had to rank it, I mean, I'll put it this way. Denise Richards, she played Christmas Jones like really well. And let's face it, I mean, she was hot as heck. Don't get me wrong. Um, in terms of like ones that um, see Bond as a potential ally in, saving the world, from my observation, I would say that goes to Wei Lin, played by Michelle Yeoh. In my opinion, I think she played that character brilliantly because with the previous film, we see two different government agencies trying to prevent a war from breaking out. With, the world is not enough, we have a British assassin teaming up with an American nuclear scientist trying to prevent a global meltdown, while at the same time trying to prevent um, the American economy from collapsing due to rising oil prices. In a way, I will say that this film at least is good as a thriller, an action thriller at least. But in terms of plot, I would say it's a little weak, but not as much compared to the next one that I'm about to go over, which of course is Die Another Day. This one obviously released in 2002, whereas The World's Not Enough was released back in 1999. This was the final outing of Brosnan at this point. And while the film itself is, I would say, a guilty pleasure of mine, I will say that um, from a writing perspective, it's pretty decent, but the motivations of the villain in this case, it was definitely lacking. And I'll eventually be going over all four in terms of which ones, from my perspective on a narrative standpoint, which one works well, which ones do not. But when we get to the start of Die Another Day, we see Bond with a team trying to infiltrate North Korea, and unfortunately, he gets betrayed. And this um, eventually causes Bond to get, you know, become a prisoner of war. And MI6 pretty much abandons him at this point because they think that he's already leaking secrets. He's likely already gone. But they find out, I mean, Bond finds out that he eventually gets traded because MI6 has one of the North Koreans try to, like, as one of their prisoners. But what led to that? So Bond basically goes in earlier to um he had to do with a transaction, and it was full of diamonds. But basically the son of the communist leader in North Korea was trying to sell Mr. Van Bierk weapons, but unknowingly to Bond, when he's portraying this other arms dealer, he gets found out, and as a result, he actually confronts the son of the leader in North Korea. And there's a chase that occurs, which eventually leads to the supposed son being killed. And eventually, we get to the opening title itself. And I'll be straight here. As decent as the song is, I don't like Madonna's music as much. I think that she did okay in this film. Yes, she has a brief cameo later on, but anyway, when Bond finds out that Zhao is the one being traded for him, he knows that someone betrayed him in North Korea. As for who that is, he will eventually find out later. But M is basically telling Bond, you know, we thought that you had betrayed us already, and we had no other choice but to strip you of your license. But eventually, he learns of a clinic in Cuba that does facial surgery and reconstruction. And one of the things that he gets is a few diamonds in a small container. So he goes over there and he finds out that he goes to an appraisal, and explains the situation that what he's looking at is conflict diamonds, and there's a unique signature on there by someone by the name of Gustav Graves. And when he learns about the clinic, he finds out that someone else is also interested in getting some information. From there, it is where he meets the American agent named Jinx, played by Halle Berry. And this one actually does try to pay homage again to one of the previous Bond films with the whole getting out of the water sequence. And Bond is portraying himself as a bird watcher. And eventually, when he realizes he needs to get some sort of a ticket to get on the island, he manages to take one from another passerby, and that was after he manages to stop by at the bar and get a drink. And by the time he gets inside this clinic, Jinx is already there to cause chaos, but Bond's main objective is trying to find out where Zhao is, and he goes in and finds out that he is also getting a facial reconstruction himself, but Bond manages to stop him, and he does get his attention through the IV that is already in him. And so he goes in and squeezes the bag, which finally causes Zhao to wake up. And he's asking him, who's bankrolling your makeover, Zhao? The same person that tried to betray me in North Korea. And despite Bond's attempts, Zhao does escape. And the doctor who actually runs the clinic gets assassinated by Jinx. And obviously Jinx destroys all the files that are in there. And Zhao eventually manages to escape. And by the time Bond tries to catch up to Jinx, she also manages to give him the slip. And I kind of bounced out of sequence there, but the whole appraisal with the diamonds was actually later. But he finds out that this Gustav Graves person is over in the UK. So he manages to get a ticket and goes to find out what's going on with this guy. Who is he? What is it with these diamonds? And one of the people that eventually tails Bond is the publicist by the name of Miranda Frost. And she is assigned by M to literally keep tabs on Bond as he's continuing his mission. So when Bond does arrive, he eventually observes the fencing exercise between Gustav Graves and Miranda. And obviously we get one moment. I'm sorry, guys. I just had to do a quick reply to something. But anyway, when Bond does arrive to observe them, we also get the brief introduction of Madonna, who was there for only like, I'd say maybe 30 seconds. And she's explaining to Bond that the background between those two. Bond actually is pointing out that with regards to the Olympics when it was going on, that the person who was going against Miranda in the Olympics said that that the guy OD'd on steroids, and she's saying that Miranda deserved it. And so anyway, so when Bond goes to fence against Gustav, Gustav is actually asking Bond best of three, and Bond is like, sure, why not? He's like, how much can you afford? But before he gives the answer, Bond loses the first one, and then he loses the second one. So when it comes to round 3, Bond manages to get one hit in. Well, he's basically asking Bond before they get to round 3, do you want to continue? Bond is actually asking Gustav, why don't we up the wages? And he's asking him, how much can you afford? And then he shows him one of the conflict diamonds that he has. And Gustav simply replies, my, they do get around, but then diamonds are for everyone. Perfect specimen, completely flawless, and chemically similar to conflict diamonds. Then you're about to lose something very precious. So when round 3 starts, Bond manages to answer Gustav's feint and attacks and manages to get a hit in, but right at one of the wrists of Gustav. And so Bond is like, I'm so sorry. Do you want to continue? And then Gustav, being the bit of a prick that he is, he's like, of course I want to bloody continue. But since we're upping your wager, let's up the weapon, shall we? And so they transition from fencing to one of the light swords. And when I mean light swords, it's like one of those medieval ones. I forgot what type it is, but eventually, when he goes from there, they eventually go from from light blades to heavy ones. And as Bond and Gustav are dueling it out, much to the terror of the people within the building, basically Gustav was pointing out, let's do it the old-fashioned way. First, blood drawn from the torso. It gets to a point where Miranda Frost has to intervene, and obviously Bond manages to get a hit in. So when Gustav actually admits defeat and, pays Bond for, the win, he invites him over to a demonstration to a project that he was working on that's referred to as Icarus. And by the time Bond does arrive, and before Bond arrives, of course, he does get introduced to his new car. There's a hilarious moment where Q, being now played by John Cleese, that when he's introduced to the car, Aston Martin likes to call it the Vanquish. We like to call it the Vanish. And as Q is giving the rundown of the specs, Q says that there might be a bit of a delay with the machine guns. He's like, "Why don't you throw yourself with this manual? You might be able to shoot through that through a couple of hours." And then we see the machine guns go over it in like less than 5 seconds, and Bond is like, "Just took a few seconds, Q." And then Cleese is looking at him really annoyed. He's like, "Wish I could make you vanish." Anyway, so Bond manages to arrive over in Iceland for the demonstration. And when he goes over to the bar, he suddenly finds Jinx is already there. And Jinx is pretty much asking, are you here for the penguins this time, or for the view again? And Bond pretty much answers her quip with, "Well, it depends on whatever. I'm more interested now in endangered species." And Jinx is like, "Oh, so does that include me?" And Bond is like, "Well, that depends on what you're up to. So I left you in an explosive situation. You're a big boy. I figured you could handle yourself." And one thing that doesn't surprise me with this film is the fact that they had some pretty obvious innuendos. When Miranda finds Jinx, she's pretty much kind of like gauging her in terms of like how she'll respond. And Jinx goes with being a publicist for Space and Science magazine. And Miranda goes like, "Really? I expect that Mr. Bond has been explaining his Big Bang Theory." And Jinx, obviously knowing this dirty joke, replies back, "Oh yeah, I think I got the thrust of it." I mean, I know it sounds dirty and all that. I mean, I get an innuendo, but I often hear a lot with some people that for some writers, depending on what films you watch, there are some guys, and arguably, female writers who also have written for films. There are some, regardless of, ethnicity and all that, that have some pretty dirty minds. Let's be frank here. I mean, I may have been in my teens when I was watching this, but I'm familiar with how certain people write. And anyway, getting back to the film here, we do get the brief demonstration of the satellite and Gustav Graves kind of like pretending that this is just for the world to use, but we later learn that it has a more nefarious purpose. So eventually, Bond does find out about the diamond mine, which is actually fake, and he goes to investigate. And what he finds is that there's another dream machine, which is basically a similar mask that was used in the clinic in Cuba, which was destroyed earlier. But anyway, he finds out that whatever the suitcase is, it harbors something else. So Gustav Graves has his henchmen actually convert the case into something else, and Zhao eventually reunites with Gustav, who we essentially learn is the son of the North Korean general that was earlier in the film. So what becomes clear here is that Bond's nemesis is the Koreans, not exactly a British individual. And Icarus turns out to be more of a weapon, if you will. And when Jinx goes in to try and infiltrate, she gets caught and restrained. And Zhao tries to torture her into getting her to spill the beans, but fails to do so. And when James goes to try and rescue her, there's some pretty funny, amusing lines in the film where not only does he have to deal with Mr. Kill, the bodyguard, but also with lasers that are trying to pretty much like dismember Jinx. And I have to say kudos to the writers on this. I mean, yes, there's some lines that seem a little silly, but when I was watching this back in 2002, like to me, it was very entertaining. So Jinx is trying to tell James to hurry it up, or I'm going to be half the girl I used to be. I don't know if that was improv or actually part of the script, but I can at least see how it tries to raise the stakes a bit. And eventually, when Mr. Kill is trying to, I guess I could say, take a stab at him, Bond manages to get the controls for the laser, and I mean, not Bond. Jinx manages to get the controls for the laser and control it up to the point where she essentially cuts him through the head. And there's a point where Bond is trying to untie Jinx, he's like, so the girl who hates to get tied down. And the irony behind that is that she pointed out to Bond earlier that she's one that is more of like tries to do things her own way and likes and hates being delayed when doing so. And he finds out later that she's part of the CIA over in America. So the fact that they're trying to stop the North Koreans, they eventually find out that one of the supposed allies is actually a traitor. When Bond tries to tell Jinx to have Miranda to get out, unfortunately, Jinx gets tricked when she goes into the exact bedroom that Miranda was in. Bond, in this case, is trying to find out the whereabouts of Gustav Graves, or in this case, the Colonel. But when Gustav actually goes to, I guess I could say, take a break, Bond is already in the room, and he's simply addressing Gustav. So you live to die another day, Colonel. At last. I was beginning to think you'd never guess. Was it painful? The gene therapy. Oh, you couldn't possibly imagine. And there's some interesting exchanges where Gustav, in this case, is pointing out that how do I put this? He's not just arrogant. He's not just arrogant, but he lets down his guard so easily that he hasn't figured out who the traitor was that betrayed him in North Korea. So when Miranda Frost comes in and Bond points out that looks can be deceiving, this is when Gustav points out to Bond, by the way, James, you never figured out who betrayed you in North Korea. Only a matter of time. You never thought of looking inside your own organization. And we see that Miranda turns the gun on him. And he's like, you little. And Gustav is like, she was right under your nose. You see, Mr. Bond, I have a gift for recognizing other people's weaknesses. Yours is women, hers and mine is winning whatever the cost. And when the villains think that they have Bond on the ropes, they didn't take into account that despite the fact he doesn't have the watch, he still has the ring finger that emits a signal to break glass. And eventually, Bond manages to escape the fake diamond mine with usage of the grappling hook that was left behind by Jinx. And he manages to not only get inside his car and try to, I guess I could say, he and Zhao have a bit of a car duel, if you will. And the only reason why that happens is because when he was trying to get inside, the snowmobile eventually, one of the snowmobiles hits the car, and Bond is like, oh great, not only is my cover blown, but I have to deal with this guy. And so we get a pretty cool chase / duel sequence on the ice between the Aston Martin and then the car that is used by Zhao. So eventually, um, we see that both are trading missiles at each other, and Bond has to um, utilize all the tricks at his disposal. And there's a point where the Aston flips over, and Zhao thinks he has him on the ropes. But what he doesn't expect is that um, when it comes down to the last missile, Bond manages to use the ejection seat to flip it and avoid getting hit. So after this missile duel, if you will, Bond manages to get inside the Ice Palace, and obviously Jinx is trapped inside. And one of the things that Miranda and Gustav do is point the satellite, if you will, over at the Ice Palace, which will cause it to melt. And unfortunately, despite Jinx's attempt at trying to get out, she unfortunately is like trapped inside. So by the time Bond does break through and get her out, he breaks the windshield using the ring to get her inside. And by the time Zhao tries to catch up to him, Zhao actually thinks he has Bond on the ropes. But what he doesn't realize is that Bond engages the invisibility cloak. I mean, not invisibility cloak. The invisibility device on the car, which throws Zhao's attack off and causes him to not only fall off into the center of the, I guess I could say, lake below, but by the time he resurfaces, Bond already has re-engaged the car. I mean, the Aston itself, fires his gun over at the hanging chandelier, and that in turn ends Zhao. By the time he's up in the air, by the time he resurfaces. So by the time he manages to get Jinx out, both eventually board the plane, and it is at this point where the suitcase gets changed into a suit. And the head of CIA points out that if you really think I'm going to be leaving this in the hands of the British to try and stop the North Koreans, you're going with them. And what is not shown is the fact that there's one particular actor that has a brief cameo as well in this film. So bear with me for a moment. I'm just about to pull it up. If you notice, Michael Madsen, he was also briefly in this film. But we also have, besides John Cleese, we also have Rosamund Pike, who played Miranda Frost, Rick Yoon, who played Zhao, and also Toby Stevens, who played Gustav Graves, who is the main antagonists of the film. Anyway, both managed to get onto the plane, and by the time Jinx tries to divert the pathway, which is going to lead into North Korea, Gustav then tells his henchmen to summon his father and the other generals. And obviously, the father is not surprised to see him. And he says, I don't even know you. And Gustav is kind of going, you always did find it difficult to accept me, father, but I never forgot what you told me. In battle, the victorious only seeks battle after the battle has been won. And when the general actually finds out that it is his son, he's like, what did you do to yourself? And Gustav obviously points out that what he's wearing, this technology that manipulates the satellite of Icarus, will be what guarantees, their victory in the war. And the general's going like, but the Americans will send nuclear warheads. Icarus will swat them from the sky. And the general at this point knows that his son is already too far gone. And at this point, Gustav is like, I have no use for you anymore. And so he outright kills him, much to the shock of the other generals. It is at this point where when Icarus is already activated, Miranda then goes to stop Jinx in trying to stop what she's trying to do, divert the plane. And so a bit of a fight goes off between those two, whereas Bond is trying to stop Gustav, but the suit pretty much prevents Bond from trying to get close. However, when Icarus actually destroys a good chunk of the plane, Gustav then tries to I guess I could say kill Bond by throwing him out the plane. But Bond notices a little something that he does not. When Gustav actually puts on the parachute, and Gustav is stating, you see, Mr. Bond, you can't kill my dreams, but my dreams can kill you. This is when Bond actually pulls the pin on the parachute, and he's telling Gustav, when Gustav is telling him, time to face destiny, Bond pulls the parachute to essentially pull Gustav out. Bond points out, time to face gravity, because there is no way anyone would be able to withstand the pulling force of the air, that's flowing from the parachute. And the suit essentially becomes the downfall of Gustav, as Bond actually causes him to get electrocuted and then shredded by the turbines. When Miranda is going off against Jinx, again, situational awareness for both of them. Miranda thinks that she's able to predict all of Jinx's moves, But what she doesn't realize is that there's one of the dueling knives that she had was connected to a religious book. And so Miranda thinks that she's got Jinx, right where she wants her, and points out, I can read your every move. And so Jinx fires back with getting her right in the chest and just simply stating, yeah, try and read this, bitch. And I will admit that while some of the puns in this film are pretty silly, I found this film pretty entertaining. And so when the connection to the satellite gets destroyed, and then Jinx and Bond are trying to escape, they find a helicopter that actually has the conflict diamonds. And while the plane is being pretty much torn asunder, both manage to barely escape. And after that, there's a funny little tidbit where we see Q and he finds Moneypenny kind of like messing around with the virtual device, albeit for reasons that Q is kind of oblivious to. But anyway, Bond eventually knows he's going to have to return those conflict diamonds, but Jinx is like, you do know we have to return these, right? He's like, just a few more minutes. And he's like, we're still going to have to return it. Anyway, if I had to give my rough assessment on this film, I did mention that this film is a little bit weak, more on the story itself than it is how it's being executed. Characterization-wise, I mean, I get the fact that they're trying to go with a different villain and trying to come up with something different. To a degree, they did try to also, I guess I would say, harken back to some of the older films. Some I have watched, others I have not. And while the main antagonist is usually communists, I will say that in terms of villains from Goldeneye up to this film, Gustav Graves in this case was pretty good, but the way how the story was executed was a little weak. So villain's decent, writing is a little lacking, characterization wise, I'd have to say that if I had to rank from best to least, from my observation, it would be 006, and then how do I put this? 006 as ranking first. Then we have Renard being second. Then Carver being third. And then Gustav being fourth. Now, why would I switch Carver and Renard in terms of like my favorite villains in this case for Brosnan? The reason being is that you have to look at it from what the motivation is. And then you also have the physical performance of the villains themselves. In this case, I would say that The ones that have the most to challenge Bond physically would be 006 because he was a former agent, and then you have Renard, who, despite getting a bullet in the head, has a lot of stamina and endurance and is able to, you know, draw out a fight physically. With Carver, he's more on the mental end with trying to manipulate, narratives and trying to get inside someone's head. Now, in terms of psychological manipulation, if I had to compare Carver and Gustav, I would say that Gustav has somewhat of an edge over Carver in the sense that we see Bond being put as a prisoner of war by the North Korean communists. And the fact that the admiral is stating that I was hoping that a Western education would help to be a bridge between our worlds, but all it did was corrupt him. While that is supposedly true from a narrative standpoint, the fact of the matter is, historically, it was Karl Marx and the communists who actually were naive in terms of how economics is balance of power and then redistribution of wealth. The reason why capitalism works, whereas communism and Marxism does not, is that when you start leeching off of others, eventually that money will run out and it will never work. And those who keep pushing for it obviously have never studied history and also never had a life. I'm just going to be blunt on that end. Now, with that being said, if I had to give this rating for Die Another Day, objectively, story wise, I'd have to give it a 6 out of 10. The characterization, at best, 7 out of 10. Subjectively, as a Brosnan fan, this one, again, it's likely the weakest. So, objectively, I might have given it a 6 in terms of story, but subjectively, this is definitely the weakest. So, this is obviously a 5 out of 10 for me. There's definitely a lot that could have been worked on with this, but the characterization was pretty good. So, characterization wise, subjectively, I'll give it a 7. Overall, if I'm going to be ranking this from the top 3, I'd have to say Goldeneye would be my first, followed by The World Is Not Enough, and then finally Tomorrow Never Dies. Obviously, the last one, Die Another Day, again, it's the weakest of the 4 narratively. And, if you guys like it, you like what you like, good for you. But honestly, overall, I will say that while the Brosnan era was the one that introduced me to 007, I will say that there's something that GoldenEye has that is lacking with 3 and 4. And arguably, some of the villains in the previous films with Sean Connery and the others are likely a lot better. But when it comes to the motivation of the villain and also the villain pointing out the flaws in the logic of the protagonist, The problem is when you get to Craig, it starts to really show that most of these people who are writing these films know nothing about the character, know nothing about masculinity, among other things. As most 007 fans have pointed out, even the women, yes, there are female fans of 007. So for those of you who are assuming that there are not, really have a stick up your ass. And I'm not apologizing for saying that. There's a reason why, guys want to be like him and girls want to be, you know, with the guy. Yes, the character is a womanizer. Yes, the guy, is suave, good looking, and has his way with gadgets and the like. But there are women who were into that type of thing back in the day. Compared to now, you now have a bunch of idiots who know nothing about, you know, masculinity and the like. There are also women who are traitors to their biology, what I call defeminized women. They do exist. This is why when you look at the Daniel Craig films, first one was good, but then it starts to slowly get worse, with the final one being the ultimate insult, not just to the original writer of 007, but to the character as a whole, as well as being an insult to fans of 007 in general. There is a reason why women are not suited for certain jobs. There is a reason why they are always an, their own worst enemy. You want to know why modern women are crazy? You look at some of the posts that are going on nowadays. You have the destroyed Me Too movement because of not just the hypocritical Hollywood actresses, and there are still a lot that do exist, that hate being born in the country that gave them the opportunity. This is why they are parasites most of the time. Now, are there ones that are sick and tired of the hypocrisy of modern women? Yes, they do exist. Depends on where you look. Are there some that know how to call them out? Yes. Are they jealous of these actresses that, are sick of the narcissist dependency syndrome that these uneducated hacks are pushing? Yes. So, frankly, if I were to look at the Brosnan era as a whole, it's definitely a guilty pleasure. Is it perfect? Not by any means. Is it really entertaining as a Bond fan? Yes. Do I think that Brosnan actually did his best with what he was given? Absolutely. With that being said, again, if you really want to take a look at um, the general thoughts of other Bond fans with regards to Connery all the way up to Brosnan and arguably Craig, do take a look at the panel done by the Phoenix Press. It's down in the description below. They go over, what Bond meant to them, which films they like, which ones they didn't like, and what have you. But with that being said, we have now come towards the end of the Brosnan era. I will probably be taking a temporary hiatus with doing some other films and reviews. But what I will be doing is going into Japanese anime at some point, what got me into it. as well as trying to cover some of my convention adventures. And that actually begins for me with Anime Expo in 2007. While I only have pictures to go off of, I will point out that what got me into anime was a few old shows from the 80s, as well as an old 80s cartoon that some people know, which is known as The Adventures of Little Nemo in Slumberland. I will eventually be covering that. So look forward to that if you guys are into retro stuff. But with that being said, this has been Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. As always, stay safe, stay sane, and always, as Orange Hat Reviews would say, stay humble. Peace.